Welcome, Guardians. In this report, I will attempt to explain the events of the Taken War, the nature of the Taken, and the aftermath of Oryx's arrival in the solar system. Oryx, the Taken King, slayer of untold billions, perpetrator of a universe-spanning genocide, arrived just inside the orbit of Saturn sometime after the House of Wolves' resurgence was decimated. But the arrival of Oryx and that of his Taken brood was perhaps foretold long before the fall of Crota, as if whispers were hinting at the coming darkness. But perhaps Oryx had commanded his son to finish off the Traveler for him, confident in Crota's ability showcased after the Vanguard failed to retake the moon, as transcribed by the Warlock Ariana III. With Crota's death, guided by the vengeful hand of Eris Morn, Guardians prepared themselves for the coming storm. A rage-fueled father and his xenophobic tendencies as they bear down on our solar system. As we continue into this report, be mindful that the Hive and Taken are far from simplistic enemies we originally assumed them to be. The Hive that followed Oryx were motivated by a goal so reasonable, so sympathetic, that in the aftermath of the Taken War, many began to question the true morality of the Traveler and that of the Light. This is the Taken War in all its intricacies. To begin, we should first discuss the Books of Sorrow, the Hive origin saga, discovered by Guardians during their incursion into Oryx's dreadnought. The Books of Sorrow showcase a tale sympathetic to the Hive's plight, as originally they were a people simply called the Krill, an insectoid race subjected to a gas giant they lived on, harsh, life-crushing environment. Fundament, they called it, a planet with 52 moons, clouds that could eat you, oceans that would swallow you, and continents that moved about the planet's surface as a hawk gliding through the air. Harsh is perhaps an understatement. Imagine a planet that tried to eliminate you from existence, a planet that wanted the rot you called a civilization exterminated from its service. This was Fundament. But the Books of Sorrow showcase the Traveler and Light, dubbed Sky by the Hive people, as a force of moral evil. It was, in a way, the sole cause of the Hive's hardship on Fundament. At least, this was the story spun to the three sisters, Oryx, Savathun, and Xivu-Arath, by the Worm Gods, or the Deep, as the Hive had referred to it. It should also be noted that these Hive Worm Gods, the source of the Hive's sadistic motivation and power source, share striking similarities to our records of the great Ahamkara hunts. Regardless if these worm gods are actually our histories, Ahamkara is still debated, but the similarities are indeed striking. Perhaps something that should be discussed at a later date. To summarize effectively, the Hive of Fundament are motivated solely by their wish to eliminate the Light through the pact they made with their new worm gods. The worm gods would deliver them the Hive from Fundament, but only if they would constantly seek conquest, constantly seek to force themselves into the blade edge of challenging the cosmos' species that cling to life. To the Hive, there was but one goal: survive the heat death of the universe by becoming the apex being. The Oryx that Guardians faced in the rings of Saturn aboard his dreadnought was a billions-year-old being improved an uncountable number of times through the conquest of his enemies. But Guardians, with no fleet power of their own to speak of, would not have to face Oryx's wrath alone, especially not his fleet of Hive capital carriers and the massive planetoid-crushing dreadnought. To the surprise of many, especially the Vanguard leadership, the Reef fleet of scuttled and commandeered fallen ketches and capital vessels met with Oryx's fleet high above the orbit of Saturn. To this day, historians, warlocks, and cryptarchs alike wonder why Marazov, Queen of the Awoken in the Reef, sacrificed herself and fleet in such a way. Perhaps it was her destiny as she had wished it. Perhaps the Nine that she often had bargained with offered her a deal to operate against Oryx. Battered and bruised, the Awoken fleet was outmatched and outgunned by Oryx's massive dreadnought, with fighter wings and catch capital guns seeing their monumentous arsenal seemingly glance off the dreadnought's hull. Morozov opted to use her harbingers, or living superweapons, but these weapons of massive destruction, too, had failed to offer any impediment to Oryx, who, either unsatisfied with battle or unamused by the Awoken's attempt at his defeat, forced out his oversoul into the material world, decimating the entire Awoken fleet, including Morozov. Aside from a few survivors like Uldren Zov, leader of the Crows, the spies of the Queen, the Awoken and the Reef would no longer be considered a military power in the solar system. The sacrifice of the Queen and the Reef's fleet did, however, bring a halt to Oryx's dreadnought, now stuck in dead orbit in a sea of mechanical debris. A side note, but another caveat that should be discussed. The Queen's body was never recovered, and as her full power was never fully understood, many believe, however unlikely, that she may still be alive, in one way or another. It was during this period, just after the Battle of Saturn, that the Taken War would truly begin for Guardians. After a period of long and peaceful silence, which followed the banishment of Crota from his Ascendant Realm and the defeat of Skolas, reports of new hive monstrosities battling the Cabal had reached the Vanguard. At first, it seemed that Oryx would do our work for us, eliminating a large operating base of Cabal skyburners, who were tasking a new invasion fleet preparing to assault Earth. It's unknown if Oryx struck out against the Cabal first because they were the closest to him, or if they were the most relevant threat. Regardless, their fire base on Phobos, the moon pulled into a perilous orbit of Mars by the Cabal Scion flares, was completely decimated. It was for the first time that Guardian fire teams had reported to the Vanguard that this power to take, as it was called, was first witnessed. An awful power, twisting and manifesting the victim into a being exquisitely more deadly than the original. While the power to take and its origins will be explained more in depth in the report on the Books of Sorrow, we can attempt a quick summarization here. During a war with one of the Xeno races mentioned in the Books of Sorrow, a race called the Ekomini, that offered up a partial resistance to the Hive's galactic conquest. Now, during this war, Oryx had discovered that the pact made with the worm gods would eventually kill them, that the worms that they had taken inside themselves constantly feed on the host's most basic desires and emotions. Ultimately, the worms lived off of the death and destruction of the civilizations that fell to the Hive. Oryx began to understand that the worm's needs would eventually outgrow the conquest and destruction made possible by the Hive war machine. The worm larvae inside Oryx and his sisters and all the Hive would eventually be consumed from within. But Oryx was cunning. He crafted a ploy so abrupt and perverse that the worm gods were caught in a moment of disbelief. Oryx called a council of his sisters, and they waylaid over their current dilemma. They felt fear for the first time in 1,000 years. But Oryx slayed his sisters Xivu Arath and Savathun, and the power that flowed through him after his familial betrayal allowed him to summon the worm god Aka, the worm of secrets. Oryx too would slay this worm and use its power to craft the Tablets of Ruin, which allowed him to utilize the power of Take, essentially forcing his will on that of a victim while grossly modifying them into warlike abominations. This is the plight that befell the Cabal on Phobos, and as Oryx bolstered his armies with enhanced versions of Centurions, Scions, and Legionnaires, Guardians began preparing for the inevitable invasion of the city. Perhaps, if a few Guardians had not acted under the efforts of the Vanguard-mentored Kate 6, the last city would have been threatened by Oryx, who at the time was seemingly turning all of our enemies against us into a massive horde of taken perversion, slaved to his will of this new taken king. With the procurement of a stealth drive coveted by Rasputin and originally borrowed by Cade 6, Guardians gained the ability to board Oryx's dreadnought without suffering the same abysmal fate as the Awoken fleet. There was one casualty of this stealth expedition, however. The spacecraft commandeered by Guardians, owned by Eris Morn, unfortunately did not make the return trip to Earth. But these first steps, although initially unpermitted by Zavala and Ikora, proved that the Taken threat was not a passive entity, that the dreadnought was the source of the Taken and Hive's power in the solar system. The mentality provided by Cade, and eventually a convinced Zavala, was that by eliminating Oryx, the head of the snake, so to speak, would force the Hive to either withdraw or weaken their command structure so significantly that they would no longer be a dire threat. A Guardian fire team would battle their way through the winding halls of the dreadnought past the piles of ancient bones, defeating infested ogres and disrupting a Cabal suicide mission just before reaching Oryx's altar. Before we continue, we should discuss the Cabal incursion within the dreadnought, as many rightfully believe that the arrival of the Red Legion was triggered by a Cabal distress signal from within the dreadnought. It is said that the Cabal have multiple words for advance, but no words for retreat, and this was embodied by their hopeless expedition into the dreadnought. But the Cabal, ever the resourceful, knew that if they could not defeat Oryx and claim the power of the dreadnought for themselves, they would have to find an ulterior mean to pacify the Taken. But their hand was forced after the Skyburners would lose Primus Tau-Un to Oryx's take ability. His bond brothers, Valis Talurn and Avalis Ma'un, would push deep within the dreadnought in a do-or-die effort. At the core of the dreadnought ship drives, which powered the massive vessel with an unknown power source, the Bond brothers would rig the entire core to detonate if their Primus was not returned to them. Naturally, Guardians knew that losing the dreadnought would not only cause calamity across the entire solar system, as the blast wave of such a detonation would most likely destroy the entire system, but also trigger the loss of a valuable strategic resource in the form of an advanced space-ready vessel. Under orders from the Vanguard, Guardian fire teams dissuaded the Bond brothers by force, ultimately ending the Skyburner threat in the dreadnought through the removal of its remaining leadership. If it was not for Oryx's initial attack on Phobos and the significant losses the Cabal received, it is unlikely that the Cabal would have signaled for help. A communique that was received and acted upon by the Red Legion to our ultimate dismay. Perhaps Gaul is not to blame for our current exodus and misfortune. Perhaps we should cast blame on the now long dead Taken King. After the immediate Cabal threat was rectified, Guardian fire teams once again began pushing against Oryx. But as Guardians soon learned, Oryx could only be truly killed in the Hive Ascendant realm, dimensions created by immensely powerful Hive in which their true form was either stored or protected. To reach Oryx, Guardians must first become worthy of ascendance, and under the guidance of Eris Morn, along with recorded logs from Tolan the Shattered, Guardians learned that their best chance of becoming an ascendant was visiting an old foe, Crota, Hope Eater. Utilizing the stealth technology that had originally allowed them to board the dreadnought unharmed, Guardians breached Crota's netherrealm during his death ceremony. Now, reports from this event vary wildly. Some claim Eris Morn had the potential of a powerful Hive creature with the ability to summon Guardians out of their netherrealm after their eventual discovery. Other reports say that the journey to Crota's netherrealm changed them, as if the Hive magic and mysticism was no longer separated from their mortal coil. Regardless, Guardians gained enough of Crota's essence to be able to pass into Oryx's ascendant realm to once and for all eliminate him. Were it so easy? As Guardians soon learned, Oryx's ascendant realm was not his final place of power, but rather a secondary realm used as a proxy to thwart potential threats. Although Oryx was incredibly deadly, his strength and cunning fine-tuned after 1 billion years of war, he too would eventually fall, leaving behind only his sword, Willbreaker, to be later reused and reforged by enterprising Guardians. As Oryx retreated to lick his wounds in his throne realm, Guardians, with the strategy of the Vanguard, planned to push their advantage of eliminating Oryx and his command structure in one fell swoop. Guardians, ever forceful and determined, would push past the court of Oryx and the wretched abominations that lied in wait into Oryx's throne realm, where the true horrors of the hive awaited. There was the War Priest, who required a hive ritual of ancient obedience to be understood and mimic before he could be felled. There was Golgoroth, a grotesque being of light and dark transfused into one. And finally, as if guarding their father from some sure annihilation, there were the Dread Sisters, spawn of Oryx, Ir Anuk, and Ir Halak. Oryx would be killed, but not through the conventional means of their light-fueled abilities or brass-encased ammunition, but rather Oryx's own arrogance of attempting to use light to create ogres of unimaginable power set to devastate Guardian fire teams as they face this final challenge. Whether through sheer luck or the sleight hand of fate, Guardians utilized the light found inside these horrid, light-infused ogres to set it upon Oryx himself. Oryx, unable to counter the cunning of Guardians, finally fell to the light he had originally gathered and coveted, leading to his true and apex defeat. His cold husk of a frame caught into a dead drift to be taken by the appetite of the gas giant Saturn. The defeat of Oryx and his taken brood would usher in a new age for Guardians, an age of triumph, where no immediate threats to the last city could be rallied. For with the first time in over 100 years, an age of peace had come. At least for a short while. Guardians gathered in the tower, refugees were guaranteed respite under the Traveler, and the whispers of the dark had been culled. But the taken throne remained empty. And if Guardians did not covet the power inside the dreadnought, others would. And new threats would eventually arise. But Guardians have proven time and time again that threats to the Traveler and the last bastion of hope for humanity would not crumble so easily under the despair provided by our enemies. Especially now in our exodus, we are defeated. Our hands tremble at the thought of the end. We stumble through the dark, attempting to pick civilization up once more and test its length against time. But Guardians are not the last city. They are not the Traveler. They aren't their victories or their defeats. Guardians are people, whether they be exo, awoken, or human. As long as just one remains, we have a chance, however faint, however dire, to recover, to rebuild, to succeed. This Dominus Gaul believes he has us defeated. His Red Legion is pillaging our city, terrorizing and killing those we were sworn to protect, because they covet the light. Perhaps it isn't jealousy. Perhaps it isn't the need to be superior. Perhaps it is fear that guides our enemies. The fear of what the light can do when pressed. Of what Guardians can accomplish when hope is short and no time remains. When Guardians are asked to do the impossible. Perhaps that is what they fear. They fear what the light is capable of. And they should be. We have a long road to recovery ahead of us, Guardians. May these reports of our history suit you well in your coming journeys.